Hi, I'm Dr. Michelle Pedicola of Secrets of Life and Death, and today I'm going to talk to you about the inner child, how she might be sabotaging your success in health, wealth, and relationships, how to identify what she's doing, how she manifests, and what you can do about it. I'm going to give you a framework for understanding what the inner child is. Now, some of you may already know. If you're a coach or a healer, you probably know exactly what an inner child is because you've been working with her for a long time. But other people might not understand. So I'm going to share my framework, which I arrived at through my work as a PhD student, studying Gestalt therapy groups, writing my dissertation on Gestalt therapy groups, a number of years working in group homes, first in Las Vegas and then in Fort Defiance, Arizona, with young adults who had emotional problems. And then, of course, the 20 years I've been working as a coach, shepherding people through major life transformations, major life challenges. So what is the definition of, or what is the explanation of the inner child? I see it as a constellation of behavior patterns that were learned at a very young age to survive as a response to some kind of trauma. Now, I have a very broad definition of trauma because children are highly vulnerable and susceptible, especially under the age of 5. The London Journal of Pediatric Care, I think that was the name of it, did a review of the literature, and psychologists agree that those first 3 to 5 years are critical because the brain is just beginning to develop and the child is just beginning to develop its sense of who it is, separate from its parents. So minor events can have a huge impact, which was what happened to me. And I'll be telling you about that in a moment. The survival is that the child needs to survive, and the pattern gets deeply ingrained, often subconscious, because it's successful. You survived, didn't you? So I'm going to be telling you some of the survival patterns, the behavioral patterns that I work with. One of them is the people pleaser. Now you might want to stop. I'm going to stop for a moment and say, well, why is this important? Because very often these patterns, they work well to help you survive as a child, but they get in the way of some of your goals and objectives. For example, a people pleaser, if you're spending all your time focusing on the outside world and trying to please people, you might not ask for what you need. You might not even think about what you need. You might never ask for your raise. You know, they talk about women receiving about 75% on the dollar compared to men. And they blame it on sexual discrimination, gender discrimination. But some of that could be that women are actually afraid to ask for raises because they have been taught to be pleasers. And a lot of women have been taught to be pleasers and are discouraged from taking on other patterns. They're seen, if they become more strong, powerful, they're seen as a bitch or domineering or out of control. So there's an encouragement. Therefore, in my own life, and I was a pleaser, that's the other way in which I really understand this pattern and how persistent and sometimes how invisible it is. I got my pattern at the age of 2. I had bonded with my father. He was a sun and moon to me, but he was in the army and he was transferred to Japan. And in the few months that we were separated, the bond broke, never to be completely restored. And by that time, I had already taken on the pattern of pleaser. I had decided that I needed to take care of myself. My mother wasn't able to address my trauma, my upset, because she was busy moving a whole household to Japan. And so I learned to tamp down my feelings, and I learned to become a pleaser. And it worked really well for a long time, and still does work. People like pleasers. You make them happy. You give them what they want. I believe that a lot of coaches and healers are pleasers, because one of the skills you get as a pleaser is the ability to really see another person, to understand their point of view, to know what they want. So I have a client who said to me, why am I so addicted to medals and certificates and getting awards? I noticed that about myself. And she said, and also what I notice is that when I don't get the response that I'm expecting, if I don't get the appreciation for the work that I do, then I feel really bad. That's the pattern of a pleaser. We get our energy from being approved of. We get our sense of feeling of safety and all is right with the world when we get those tokens of approval. The problem is, hey, thank you for joining. The problem is that it really gets in the way of you stepping into your power. And if you're going to be a coach or a healer or a change maker or a solo entrepreneur who is selling yourself or your services, you have to get this handled, because it will get in the way. It will sabotage you. You will be afraid to ask for what people owe you. You will be afraid to ask for money in the first place. You will be afraid to ask people to enroll with you. You know, that's why those funnels are so popular out on the internet, is the idea that, well, the clients will just sort of roll in, and maybe you have a program on there so you don't ever have to deal with them. But that's not what we're here for. And that's not where real change happens. You actually have to interact with people. And I believe that you can actually change. Now, I told you that there are other patterns that I have run across in my work. Another pattern I work with is what's called the controller. The controller comes from a very different dynamic. While the pleaser comes from a place of abandonment, and yes, indeed, that client of mine at the age of 4 went in to get a tonsillectomy. Her parents had promised her they would be there when she came out of anesthesia. It was a very traumatic experience, and when she came out, they had put her, the doctors, the hospital had put her in a burn ward, and she looked around and she saw all these burned children, and she thought she had died and gone to hell. And it was so traumatizing that she stopped speaking for months. And it still impacts her, that fear of somebody walking away. Now, the controller comes from more of an abusive pattern. It could be verbal abuse, it could be physical abuse, it could be sexual abuse, it could be fighting among your parents. But the situation is chaotic, and the child finds ways to control their environment to keep them safe. Maybe they stay away a lot, they find activities that keep them out of the house. Or maybe, as with one client, she actually had to go out in the middle of the night and pull her mother out of the bars and bring her mother home. Hi, thank you for joining. To bring her mother home in order to create some sort of safety. So these patterns are developed very early in our childhood. They keep us alive, and then later on, they get in the way. So I told you how the pleaser gets in the way. It prevents you from asking for what you need. It prevents you from even thinking what you need. I did not even know I was a pleaser until I was nearly 50 years old. Even though I had done the healing work, I didn't have that concept. And then when my mother was dying and she said that she had regrets, and my mother was the poster child for living a life true to oneself. She was a toy designer. She went out to New York. She sold her designs to major toy companies. sometimes the neglect of her children, but she went after her passion. Now, if she could have regrets, what did that mean? What did that mean for me? It woke me up. It caused me to make a makeover in my life. And it was a long journey. And by the way, if you want to do a makeover, I actually have a 5-day makeover challenge that I want to gift with you. If you look in the comments section, you can see the link that will take you there. It's a 5-day training. It's got trainings, it's got worksheets, and it's a really great way to get you to start to change your pattern, to identify what it is. Because a lot of it has to do with awareness. I wasn't even aware. It's taken a long, long time for me to become aware, to understand the dynamic that was controlling me, that was causing me to become smaller and smaller and smaller because I did not like to be rejected. Now, by the way, it's not just the pattern. Human beings do not like to be rejected. We're actually wired to bond with each other, to connect with each other, because we are a social species. And the disapproval of our tribe, of our community, back in the old days, it meant death. And so we experience that on a biological and a physiological level. We want to please, we want to fit in some way, we want to feel safe. So interestingly, both the pleaser and the controller want to feel safe. It's just a little bit different. So the controller, what's the problem with the controller? Oftentimes they are successful in life because they don't care what anybody else thinks. They go after what they want because they've given up on their parents. They're going for what they want and they're taking care of themselves. The problem is that they have a hard time relating to other people. And so sometimes they get in trouble with their employees or their bosses. Sometimes they are independent entrepreneurs because they have a hard time with authority. And probably more disturbing, it's difficult in relationships. What controllers tend to do is find a partner they can control. Because while the pleaser is addicted to the likes, the controller is addicted to working on their project. Kind of like the story of Pygmalion or My Fair Lady, where the controller literally has a project that they're working on to perfect. And oftentimes you find a controller and a pleaser in a relationship. It's kind of like an interesting dynamic, but it's torturous too, because the pleaser can never please the controller. Why? The controller doesn't want to be pleased. If the pleaser, the project, succeeds in satisfying them, they'll be out of their job. So they want to keep that person always never quite right. And they don't even know that they're doing it. It's so habitual. Maybe they even learned that habit from the modeling of their parents, much in the way that I learned the pleaser pattern from my father. He was a pleaser. His form of pleasing was to be a hero and save people. So that makes the relationship difficult. But the other way makes the relationship difficult also, because as long as you're a pleaser, you're wearing a mask. You're pretending that you are something other than who you are in order to please the other person. And a lot of weird, crazy adaptions come up in order to make the relationship work. And sometimes the pleaser leaves the relationship because she gets fed up. Unfortunately, unless she works on the pattern, unless she changes her behavior constellation, she's very likely to end up with the same kind of guy the next time, which indeed was the case for me. Actually, the second husband is more of a controller than the first one was, and they both were. So I don't recommend that you walk away. I actually recommend that you work on the problem. So let's see, I've talked about the patterns. So there are two more patterns that are that show up. One is the self-soother. This is like the controller, only the controlling is turned inward. The self-soother finds ways to make themselves feel better because they cannot succeed. They cannot succeed. They do not have any success in the world. And so they soothe themselves either through eating or drinking or drugs or computer games. And they disassociate from the world because the world is an unsafe place. So they find a place that feels safe. And sometimes they use this a little bit as controlling because they can manipulate people through martyrdom or through their inability to function. Hi, Terry. Thank you for joining. Their inability to function. They actually have somewhat of that controlling dynamic. Although, trust me, they all have a controlling dynamic. So the dynamic that's the self-soother often is difficult because they don't want to give up their addictions. And they have no desire. It often takes a really big crisis to make them realize their pattern and want to change. Now, the fourth pattern that I've noticed is the pattern I call the rebel. This is like the controller, but instead of trying to control the situation to make things work, they actually try to destroy because they're so angry that they want to get back at their parents. They want to get back at the authority figures. And they have a real hard time. They're not quite as successful in the world as the straight, ordinary controller because they're always sabotaging themselves and they're sabotaging other people. And you often find these people in movements that are trying to change the status quo. And so they can actually feel justified in their rebelliousness. I want to point out again that all these patterns can show up at some time or another in your behavior. Sometimes you might actually act pretty rebellious. Or sometimes you may really want to control a situation even though you're a pleaser. But one pattern tends to be more dominant than the other. And you actually want to learn some of the skills of the other pattern because there are skills in that. As I mentioned, with the pleaser, the skill is actually to be able to see another person, to understand their perspective and know what they want. Controllers have a real hard time with this. They experience the world all from themselves. And so they could learn from pleasers how to be more pleasing, how to be more aware of other people, and not to be so hard fast in their own beliefs and system. So how do you change these patterns, right? What's the question? So I mentioned already, you might start by doing my 5-day makeover challenge. There's a link up in the comments section. It takes work. It takes work, and it's a journey because the behaviors are very integrated into your system. And the triggers that trigger the memory, that trigger the pattern, are very volatile because it goes all the way back to survival. And it puts you right in your lower brainstem, that instinctual level. Most of us aren't even aware that we have these patterns. We don't see them. We don't have a consciousness of them. We may dismiss them because they just aren't that important, or nobody calls us into question, or we fight and we're very defensive because we don't want to hear about it. But they actually are holding you back from having happiness in your life, having success in your life in one way or the other. You can be very successful in wealth and miserable in your relationship. You could be very successful in your relationship and have a hard time getting people to pay you. And then there's the whole other dynamic of how is your health? When a mammal is stressed, they eat. That is kind of wired into the system. If you've ever seen animals that, well, they may flee first, but I've noticed that some animals, when they are really nervous, they eat. Why? Because when you eat, First of all, it feels soothing. It goes all the way back to our mother's milk, right? Mammals, mother's milk. It feels soothing. But actually, there are chemical components in the food that will make you feel different, at least for a while, that will soothe you. Only it's short term, and it can get into a habit in which you eat more and more and more because you want to soothe whenever you're upset. And boy, I see that in myself. That if I'm feeling agitated or nervous, oh my gosh, I want a piece of chocolate. And it takes willpower to change these patterns, to change them for a different one. And what I learned when I was working on the Navajo reservation, when I was working with children, is that you have to replace the pattern. You can't just tamp it down. One of the problems that we have in this culture is that we do tamp down our emotions. We're taught to tamp down our emotions because they interfere with us being productive workers in the workforce. And we're problematic in school, so we're taught at a very early age to shut down our emotions. You're not going to change your patterns if you do not have access to your emotions. So that's one of the things that I work with my clients on, is how to release their emotions so that they are not trapped. Now, why do you not want your emotions to be trapped? Why is it not good to hold it down? And we have a whole generation, several generations of men that have been literally taught to do that. That's how it's really hard for them to let that go. They do not want to go into those emotions. Why? Because they go back into their childhood, and it's scary. The problem is the emotions are part of our survival system. They are there to help us be more discerning when an event happens and we need to decide whether it is safe or not safe. And when we are triggered, chemicals are released in our body. ACTH, adrenaline, all the resources are sent to the extremities of our body. Our heart beats faster. There are all kinds of physiological activities that go on as a result of being triggered. And if you don't release that energy, it gets trapped in your body, and it is toxic because you don't want those chemicals in your body. It lowers your immune system. It can make you sick. And if you are in a constant state of anxiety, you are constantly generating that chemistry in your body. And why would you be in a constant state of anxiety? Well, if you're a people pleaser and you're worried about pleasing people all the time, and you're living with a controller who doesn't like what you're doing, you're going to be in a state of anxiety. And the controller, if they're not getting what they want, they're also in a state of anxiety. And so there's always these bursts because we hold it down and then they explode. And that is not a very effective way of living your life. Let's see, what else do I have here? Well, I've talked about how it affects your life. I've talked about how the dynamic works. I work with my clients by helping them to see the pattern and to replace the behavior with new behavior that's more effective behavior that really works. If you would like to know more, well, sign up for the Makeover Challenge. There is an opportunity to speak with me if you like the kind of work I do. I think that's it for today. Well, I'm going to say one more thing. I think it's interesting how our patterns of behavior and what we've learned influences how we respond to crisis in our lives. And of course, we are all going through a major crisis right now, aren't we? Those patterns actually dictate our response. So the pleasers, of course, are all accommodating. They're all wearing the masks. And the controllers may be feeling a little rebellious. Some of them have enough pleaser pattern in them that they do don the masks. And then we are bombarded with these posts on Facebook that tell us to go this way or that way. And there's a lot of fear out there. And if you haven't developed a way of controlling your emotions, of mastering, not controlling, but mastering, that is allowing them to release and to shift the story so that you're in a state that is more conducive to production, problem solving, and happiness. I recommend that you do the Makeover Challenge. Find out what area of your life is not in balance and what you can do about it, what the problems are, what the blocks are, and then have a conversation with me if this resonates with you. That's it for today. Hope you enjoyed this. Be brilliant, and until next time, bye for now.